It is good to be together today. So glad to see all of you here this morning. Happy Father's Day to all of you. We certainly are glad to show our appreciation and thanks to the fathers and grandfathers and oh so many father figures in our lives and even in this church family as well, who have made such a difference to us and to our lives. And I also think it's just so fitting that we're spending this morning and this series in the book of Proverbs on a day like today, because much of the book of Proverbs, as we saw in our scripture reading just a moment ago, much of this book of the Bible is written like a father writing to a son, sharing words of wisdom for life. And we need that. In my life, I have needed that. In the church, we desperately need that. And so we want to say thank you today to those fathers and grandfathers and others who have done exactly that. Life. When I was a young child, I know that I never considered and certainly could not have told you what wisdom is. But as I look back today on those early days and years, I think I can tell you where wisdom was, where it was found. It was found in an old tan recliner in our living room. We called it the big chair in our house on North Ridge Road. It was found in the soft yet serious voice of my father when I was young enough and small enough that he could scoop me up off the ground, and I was prone to a few outstanding outbursts and fits from time to time. I can't tell you how many times he scooped me up and put me in his lap and straightened me out just a little bit. There were simple lessons that I learned in that chair. Like, it's perfectly okay to not like green beans, but it is not okay to say, I hate this stuff at the dinner table to your mom. Do not do that. Wisdom says don't do that. And it's perfectly well and good to run around in the backyard, but not around corners in the church building, and certainly not in the streets. That was a place in my life, that chair, where wisdom was found. Sometimes he would even pull up my brother and me both at the same time when we were small enough to do this, and we were bickering with one another, and that was the most uncomfortable of all. Here we are angry with one another, and now we're sharing this same chair, and we'd sit there angry until finally the anger passed, and we would work things out. That chair was a place of wisdom for me. And I definitely learned a lot more than just the lessons that were spoken when I was sitting in that chair with my dad. Last week we did begin a series in the book of Proverbs, and this is a series on wisdom. Today I want us to begin to think about the foundational question that really kind of starts it all. What is wisdom? This is a question that we really need to spend some time with if we're going to spend any time in the book of Proverbs. And like I said, when I was a child, I certainly couldn't have told you what the answer to this question is. Even today, it humbles me to because I know that I'm still learning. And maybe today we still have trouble putting our finger on what exactly wisdom is. But what I would like to invite you to do this morning is what I think the Proverbs invite us to do. As we think about what wisdom is, let's first ask a little different question. Where is wisdom? Because when we can think about where wisdom is found, maybe this will help us to see what it is and apply it in our lives. So I want to ask you this morning to consider, where is wisdom found? Where have you seen it? Where have you noticed it in your life? Can you think about a person in your life that you would consider wise? Can you picture a time in your life when someone acted or someone said something and you saw it and you said, that's wisdom. That was wise what they did right there. What was it about that person? What was it about that action that made you say, that was wisdom? Maybe it's a parent or a grandparent. Maybe it's a Sunday school teacher from when you were growing up. Maybe it's a friend who goes to breakfast down at the coffee shop with you. Where is wisdom found? Where can we see it? Who in your life is wise? When the book of Proverbs begins and it makes it very clear to us that this is a book about wisdom. In fact, the very first 7 verses are called a prologue or introduction to this whole book. And we're going to spend some time in those 7 verses, verses 1 through 7 of chapter 1. And it makes it clear right away that this is a book about wisdom. And what I can't help but notice is that what wisdom is and where wisdom is found go hand in hand in this book. And if we know where wisdom can be found, like really know its source, that is when we're going to be able to know wisdom and use it in our lives. Listen to this as we read together. Chapter 1 in the book of Proverbs. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for the purpose of attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, for doing what is right and just and fair. We'll come back to that. For giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. And let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. So right here from the start, we learn what is the purpose of this book, the book of Proverbs and its chapters and verses. This is a book that is given to us for attaining wisdom and discipline in our lives. And right here from the start, we are told that if you want to know what that is, if you want to know what wisdom is, start with where it's found. Consider its source, the beginning. First step toward knowledge and wisdom and discipline is finding its source. And in Proverbs, that source is clear. It is the fear of the Lord. It's where it all begins. So verse 7 says right here, as you can see, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The very same thing, or similar thing, will be said in chapter 9 about wisdom. It too begins with the fear of the Lord. You see, what wisdom is and where it is, where it's found, they go hand in hand. And wisdom has a source. It is ultimately found in fearing God. I wonder if I were to ask you to think back to that person that I asked you to think about earlier. That person who seems to be wise to you. Or maybe think back to that situation you were thinking about earlier where you saw wisdom taking place. Was the fear of the Lord there in that person, in that situation? My guess is for many of us, those two go hand in hand in the people we know wise. The fear of the Lord, Proverbs says, is the beginning of knowledge. It is the beginning of wisdom. And sometimes we hear a phrase like this, the fear of the Lord. And we're prone to do one of two things. In one case, we may be prone to cringe a little bit. Some people may. Thinking that the fear of the Lord is only having to do with thinking that there's a God out there who's out to get you, as if that's what this is. Others of us may have another reaction to want to edit this phrase just a little bit, airbrush it just a little bit, so that this fear of the Lord, it doesn't sound so fearful as it does right here in this verse. I think that the Bible gives so much more depth and balance to our understanding of this phrase than either of those two things. In fact, there's a person named Elise McKenzie who says that To fear the Lord is to tremble, trust, and transform in the presence of God. And I think that there's something to be said for this. All of these things here at once. First, there is indeed a sense in which we tremble in the presence of an awesome and holy and mighty God. If we were to stand in the presence of an awesome and holy and mighty God and not tremble, that would be somewhat callous, right? We would be numb to the power of this God. If you think about when Pharaoh in the story of the Exodus hardens his heart before the Lord, what he is saying essentially is, I do not acknowledge, I do not fear the power of this God who says, let my people go. I'm Pharaoh. I can do what I please. Pharaoh most certainly does not tremble in the presence of the Lord, and that ends up being a problem for him. It is foolishness for him to do that. That sort of attitude in the face of God it opposes our growth in wisdom, puts ourselves on the throne rather than putting God where he belongs. Instead, God invites us to know him as he really is. And the fact of the matter is, if we're going to know him as he really is, what he is a God of all power, and a God of all knowledge, and a God who truly is holy. And so if we're going to recognize him for who he is, which he wants us to do, our gut is good when we say, who am I? One of the wisest people I know is a woman named Barbara. She lives in Arkansas. Her husband passed away. He was a preacher. He passed away early on in life. I never knew her then, and I met her only after that time. And I remember distinctly the time when I was talking with Barbara, and she just quoted off the top of her head, like she'd done it 1,000 times, Exodus chapter 15, verse 11. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders. These were words that my friend had committed to heart. These were also the words that Israel says when they're free from the hardened heart of Pharaoh. When they've crossed over to the other side and they're standing on the other side of the Red Sea, when they've looked back and they've watched and they've seen their bondage washed away by the hand of the Lord, they stand on the other side and they tremble. And they're right in their gut to wonder, who is like this God? That's the fear of the Lord. Proverbs says that's where wisdom begins. But the fear of the Lord is more than just trembling. It's more than just a gut reaction to the awesome power of our God. Deuteronomy says to us that the fear of the Lord is also a choice. It's a choice we make in our heads and in our hearts, not just in our gut. It's a choice that we make to walk in obedience to him. Chapter 10, verse 12 says, to love him, to serve the Lord with your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul. It goes on to say, to fear the Lord is to serve him. It is to hold fast to the Lord, to cling to him. In other words, it transforms us. It's more than just an emotion we may feel when we think about how great God is. It's a choice we make in our hearts, in our minds, in our lives, to worship, serve, and follow the God that we fear. It changes our behavior. It changes our hearts. It transforms us. We choose to cling to him, to hold fast to him, to choose his way. And here's the beautiful thing. When we live in that sort of humble harmony with him, when we walk in his ways, something amazing happens. Our fear can turn to trust. Our fear leads to trust. The fear of the Lord actually becomes this fear that ends all other fears. Because what else can we fear if we walk with a mighty God? The fear of the Lord makes all of those lesser fears pale in comparison to the God that we know as He really is, who walks with us and deserves our trust. To fear the Lord, then, is to tremble, trust, and be transformed in His presence. And the very same thing that causes us fear releases us from fear. We know Him as He really is, a God who loves and wants to walk with us. And so to bring it back to Proverbs, the Proverbs can say in the same breath, blessed is the one who always trembles before God, because whoever hardens their heart, like Pharaoh, falls into trouble. And yet, the fear of the Lord leads to life. Then one rests content, untouched by trouble. You see how the one who fears is actually free to rest confidently in the Lord that we trust. Okay, so we know a little bit about where wisdom is then. We know its source. It comes, according to the Proverbs, from the fear of the Lord, this decision that we make in our lives, this posture we adopt where we tremble before Him, we trust in Him, and we let Him work on our lives and our hearts and change us. When we know Him as He is, this is where wisdom starts. It's where it begins. So what does this have to say then about what wisdom is? What does this say about our next question? I think the connection is this. If wisdom comes from knowing God as He really is, from the fear of the Lord, then what wisdom is applying what we know about God as He really is to our lives. Wisdom is applying the knowledge of God to our lives. What we know is true of God's character, what we know is true of His Word, the knowledge of God applied to life, that is wisdom for us. That word applied there is really key, and I think we're going to find how that works in Proverbs 1 through 7. I think we also just know how it works in our lives. When my dad would sit me down in the old tan recliner, the big chair, and he would tell those things to me, he wasn't just trying to give me knowledge or facts. Like sometimes it's okay to run around and play. Instead, what he wanted is for me to know how to decide what situations it's okay to run and when it's okay not to run, when we absolutely shouldn't run. You see the difference between just getting knowledge and applying it to the everyday situations we face. That's wisdom. When the Old Testament talks about this word wisdom, it uses it two ways. One time it uses it in a more general sense. Sometimes it even uses it to talk about skills or abilities that people have. In Exodus chapter 36, we get this story about these two fellows with funny names, Bezalel and Oholiab. And we're told in this story that they were skilled persons to whom the Lord had given skill, literally it's the word wisdom, and ability to know how to carry out their work. And the work that they did was they worked on the tabernacle, the sanctuary of the Lord. So we have these people who know how to use this gift from God, and it is wisdom when they take what they know and they apply it to the work of the Lord, to the making of this tabernacle. Their skillfulness is applied in life. And he uses the word wisdom to describe that. It's kind of like when we're in science class and we have lab days. If you remember lab days, or if you ever took physics and you had to make a mousetrap car. Anybody ever have to do that before? When you do a project like that or something like that, you're taking these things that you're supposed to know at this point, these theories and these knowledge and things, you're supposed to be applying it to a specific situation. A specific thing that you're working on. It's knowledge applied. Wisdom is like that. In Proverbs, though, it has more to do with our character than it does with the skill. It has more to do with our virtue than it does with like a craft that we know how to do really well. But it's still no less knowledge applied. In this case, we are applying what we know about God, what we know to be true of His character and true of His word. And we take that and we apply it in the hands-on situations of our actual lives. That's what wisdom does. So in Proverbs 1, we're told that these words are given to us for the purpose of attaining wisdom and discipline. But not just so we have it in our heads, but in order that we might do what is right and just and fair in everyday life, in the everyday situations that we face. And the only way that's possible, the only way to have that kind of wisdom, we have to go to where it starts. We cannot apply what we know of God to everyday life unless we know the Lord. And so the fear of the Lord will always be the beginning of wisdom. I want to talk as we close about one last place where I've seen this wisdom found, and maybe it'll paint a picture for us for how this makes sense. That wisdom is taking what we know of God and actually bringing it into our everyday lives. Once I remember finding wisdom on a Post-it note on somebody's refrigerator door. I was visiting a friend. He was dealing with a difficult illness in his life. And he was struggling with this illness and struggling with the fear that it brings to life. And so he had put a Post-it note on his door. It was Joshua chapter 1 and verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will go with you wherever you go. There were other sticky notes like that throughout the house. They were reminders of what we know is true of God. That He's holy and awesome and He walks with us wherever we go. And they were reminders that took what we know to be true and applied it in that really difficult moment and says, I will have this attitude when I face this. I know this to be true generally, that God walks with us wherever we go. But I'm going to bring it here to how I live my life. I see wisdom in that. Wisdom taking what we know to be true of God in the fear of the Lord and trusting in Him to help us live it out in our lives. I want to offer a challenge to us today, and maybe the challenge is that you look at your life and you say, where can wisdom be found? It's wherever I'm living. Wherever I'm living, I need to take and try to bring my relationship with God to bear on how I act, the words I use, the approach to life that I take. Maybe the challenge to you on this Father's Day is to be the kind of person who knows the Lord and who seeks wisdom in your life so that you can pass it down to those who need you to pass it down to them, your children and others in this church family. Of course, we know that above all, it's the gift of God that we can ever know Him at all. And it's the gift of God's grace that we can ever stand before Him and do anything more than just tremble in His awesome presence.